It was the kind of summer night that never quite cools down, the air still, heavy, and humming with the sound of crickets in the Tennessee dark. The town of Lewisburg lay quiet beneath a pale half-moon, its narrow streets empty, except for the occasional passing car or porch light flickering in the distance. Inside a small white farmhouse at the end of Cedar Creek Road, 6-year-old Hannah Reese was fast asleep under her floral bedspread. Her mother, Claire, had tucked her in hours earlier, smoothing her hair the way mothers do when they think their children are too young to remember it later. Hannah had insisted on sleeping with her favorite stuffed bunny, the one with one eye missing. She said it kept the bad dreams away. Her father, Mark, wasn't home that night. He was on the graveyard shift at the Lewisburg auto plant, a job he'd taken after layoffs at the paper mill. He was known for being steady, dependable, a man who kept his lunchbox clean and his routines cleaner. Every night, he'd call home at midnight just to check in. Claire would tell him Hannah was asleep, the house was quiet, and he'd remind her to lock the doors. It had been that way for years. But sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, something broke that rhythm. At 7:03 a.m., when the sun had just started to burn off the fog along Cedar Creek, Claire Reese walked into her daughter's room to wake her for breakfast. She called her name once, softly, then again, louder. When there was no answer, she pulled back the covers and her body locked. The bed was empty. The sheets were cold. The pillow was on the floor, and the small stuffed bunny lay just beneath the window, its fur gray with dust. The window screen had been sliced open from the outside. Within minutes, panic became paralysis. Claire ran through the house screaming her daughter's name, searching closets, under the bed, even the pantry, anywhere a 6-year-old could hide. But the house was still. The dog, a gentle old retriever, paced nervously by the back door, tail low, whining. He hadn't barked all night. That fact would haunt investigators for years. At 7:24 a.m., Claire called 911. Her voice, trembling and hollow, was recorded saying just 9 words that would echo through decades of headlines. "My little girl is gone." The windows open. By the time deputies arrived, the quiet country road was choked with flashing lights. Neighbors gathered at their fences, whispering, praying. Officers swept the home, taking photographs, dusting for prints. One deputy knelt near the window and pointed to something, a faint smear of mud on the sill, as if from a boot or glove. Another found small impressions in the grass outside, partial footprints leading toward the tree line, then disappearing into the dense brush. Within hours, the case had transformed from a domestic panic into a full-scale search. The Lewisburg Police Department called in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation before noon. Roadblocks went up on the nearby highway. Search dogs were deployed, weaving through the fields. Helicopters combed the woods. Every pond, every drainage ditch, every abandoned barn within 5 miles was searched. But the trail went cold almost as soon as it began. That first day was chaos. Volunteers with flashlights combing through tall grass, mothers clutching their children tighter, officers marking off grid squares on paper maps. Neighbors came forward with statements. One woman swore she heard a car door shut around 1:30 a.m. Another said she saw a light flicker in the Reese backyard but assumed it was a raccoon. The Reese's next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Howard Price, told investigators he'd seen a blue pickup parked near the end of the road the night before, though he couldn't recall the plate number. Inside the Reese home, investigators found almost nothing else out of place. No signs of forced entry elsewhere, no fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. Even the child's bedroom, apart from the cut screen, was strangely undisturbed. No overturned furniture, no struggle, no sound reported by neighbors. By nightfall, the small town was in shock. Hannah's photograph, a smiling blonde-haired girl in a yellow dress, missing a front tooth, was on every local news broadcast. The image of her stuffed bunny lying beneath the window became a grim symbol of innocence lost. Reporters descended on Lewisburg, turning the Reese's front yard into a maze of camera tripods and microphones. Mark Reese, still in his work uniform, arrived home just after police had sealed off the bedroom. The sight of patrol cars and flashing lights made him drop to his knees before he even reached the porch. Officers had to restrain him from entering the scene. He would later tell a reporter he felt like he'd stepped into someone else's life, that none of it felt real. As the hours turned into the second night, search teams expanded their radius. Helicopters used infrared scanners. K-9 units followed faint scent trails that vanished near an old service road. Detectives interviewed family members, co-workers, anyone who might have known the Reeses. Nothing stuck. Theories began to spiral. A stranger abduction, a custody dispute, a drifter passing through town. But the Reeses had no enemies, no debts, no reason anyone would want to hurt them. By the end of the week, the sheriff's department held a press conference on the courthouse steps. "We're pursuing every possible lead," the sheriff said, his face drawn and weary. "We will find Hannah." Behind him, Claire stood silent, clutching her daughter's photo to her chest. Her eyes looked somewhere past the cameras, like she already knew she wouldn't see her child again. Lewisburg changed after that. Porch lights stayed on all night. Kids weren't allowed to ride bikes past dark. Every open window became a threat. And in that farmhouse on Cedar Creek Road, the silence grew unbearable. Investigators would spend the next 24 hours combing every inch of land they could, believing Hannah might still be alive, lost, hidden, or taken to a nearby property. But by the second sunrise, hope began to fade. The search dogs had gone quiet. The helicopters circled one last time and pulled away. And as the small town began to wake to another day without answers, one question began to sink in: how does a 6-year-old vanish from her own bedroom without a trace? That question would follow the Reese family for the next quarter century, and when the truth finally surfaced, it would come from evidence no one even knew still existed. In the days that followed Hannah's disappearance, Lewisburg stopped feeling like a small town. It became a search grid. Deputies marked off perimeters on hand-drawn maps, while volunteers lined up in church parking lots before dawn, armed with flashlights, ropes, and coffee thermoses. Local farmers opened their fields to be searched. Every drainage ditch, every culvert, every stretch of roadside brush was combed through again and again. For the first week, hope still lived in every movement. People believed they might find her hiding, frightened, maybe hurt, but alive. Helicopters hovered low over the riverbanks. Search dogs barked as handlers called her name through bullhorns. By the 10th day, that hope had started to sound forced. The woods surrounding Cedar Creek had given up nothing: no clothing, no footprints, not even a trace of that stuffed bunny she never went anywhere without. Investigators chased every lead they could get their hands on. A delivery driver reported seeing a light-colored pickup truck parked near the cul-de-sac sometime after midnight. Officers found tire impressions but no plate number, no clear description. A rest stop attendant an hour south thought he'd seen a man traveling with a little girl who matched Hannah's description. When police caught up to the vehicle, it turned out to be a father and his daughter heading home from vacation. Even a relative on Claire's side briefly came under suspicion because of an old misdemeanor record, something to do with stolen tools, but that angle fell apart within hours. Still, the whispers spread faster than any official update. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles to the Reese's door began to speak in lowered tones at the grocery store. Why hadn't the dog barked? Why didn't Claire hear the window open? And why, reporters started to suggest, did her story change slightly between interviews? The investigation itself began to fracture under the weight of so many dead ends. Detective Harold Benton, the lead investigator, had been with the department for 22 years. He was steady and methodical at first, but the longer the case dragged on, the more his certainty narrowed. He became convinced Hannah must have known whoever took her that she'd let them in, maybe a neighbor or family acquaintance. His focus tightened around that theory so completely that other leads began to die on his desk. Meanwhile, the community tried to hold on to some version of hope. Candlelight vigils filled the town square every Friday night that summer. Hannah's schoolteacher spoke at one, holding back tears as she described the empty desk with the crayon marks still on its surface. A local business owner printed hundreds of missing child flyers at his own expense. They hung in store windows, at gas stations, even along the interstate. But rain and heat warped the paper, fading Hannah's smile until the posters looked like ghosts of themselves. By July, the Reeses could barely step outside without cameras following them. National news crews arrived, looking for a new headline, and when the story stopped producing fresh developments, they turned their lenses inward. Claire's composure on camera, her stillness, the blank exhaustion in her eyes became its own point of scrutiny. Viewers wrote letters asking if she seemed too calm. Mark, usually quiet and reserved, lashed out once during a press conference, shouting at a reporter who asked if he and his wife had taken lie detector tests. Behind closed doors, the strain was unbearable. Claire couldn't sleep. She kept Hannah's room exactly as it had been, the sheets remade every morning as if her daughter might return that night. Mark threw himself into work, taking double shifts just to stay out of the house. The marriage that had once seemed unshakable began to crack under the silence that filled the space between them. When summer turned to fall, the sheriff finally requested federal assistance. The FBI arrived with their own technicians, their own procedures, their own quiet doubts. They re-examined everything: the window frame, the cut screen, the faint smudge of blood that couldn't be identified with the technology available then. They collected fibers from the carpet, soil from the windowsill, even paint chips from the porch railing. But this was 1991, DNA analysis was in its infancy. The partial fingerprints were smudged beyond comparison, and the fibers were too common to narrow down. Weeks became months. The command post shut down. Search teams dwindled. What had once been a massive community effort became a handful of officers working late nights, going through the same evidence again and again, hoping they'd missed something. By Thanksgiving, the story had slipped from the nightly news. Another case somewhere else took its place. Lewisburg returned to a kind of uneasy normalcy, one where parents double-locked their doors and left hallway lights on at night. The Reese family, unable to bear the stares and the reminders, packed up what was left of their lives and moved 2 counties over. They didn't sell the house. They couldn't. It sat at the end of Cedar Creek Road for years, empty, the windows boarded up, but still recognizable by the patch of bare dirt where search teams had once lined up at dawn. Inside, Hannah's bedroom remained sealed. The yellow tape that had marked the crime scene was gone, but faint adhesive stains still lined the doorframe. Dust settled over her toys, her books, her drawings, taped to the wall, one of them, a crayon picture of her family standing under a blue sky. For the detectives who had worked the case, the silence was unbearable. Some retired, some transferred, but the file never left their thoughts. Every few years, someone would reopen it, run through the same interviews, the same theories, and reach the same end. By the time autumn faded into winter, the search for Hannah Reese had become another cold file in the evidence room, a cardboard box labeled simply, "Missing Child, 1991." And though no one knew it then, inside that box lay the smallest trace of blood on a windowsill sample, too degraded for testing, stored away, and forgotten. It would stay there for 25 years, waiting for the moment when science and fate would finally catch up. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, fact-checking, and rebuilding real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 2 weeks of work, long nights, and careful digging to uncover the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering these mysteries, please like, subscribe, And tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. Now, let's get back to the case. By the late 1990s, Hannah Reese's disappearance had taken on a life of its own in Lewisburg. It was no longer just a tragedy, it had become a story people whispered about when the nights grew long and the cicadas went quiet. Parents still spoke her name in warnings, reminding their children not to wander too far from home. School teachers, new to the area, learned quickly to avoid the subject. The house on Cedar Creek Road, once just another family home, was now a place kids dared each other to approach. The front porch sagged, the windows were boarded, and weeds had swallowed the fence line. Every Halloween, teenagers would drive out there, park just far enough away that they could still run back to their cars, and swear they saw movement behind the upstairs window. But for the people who actually lived through it, especially Claire and Mark Reese, the story was not a legend. It was a wound that refused to close. Claire, once a soft-spoken woman known for her garden and her patience, had turned into a shadow of herself. She stopped attending church, stopped opening the blinds, and rarely answered the phone. The house they'd moved into after leaving Lewisburg was quieter than ever, her days measured by medication schedules and the hollow click of the television in the background. Friends tried to visit, but they said it felt like Hannah's absence lived in the walls, like Claire was waiting for something she couldn't name. Mark tried to keep moving. He worked longer hours, switched jobs, and eventually remarried. He told people he had to start living again, but the truth was, he never really did. His new wife once found him sitting in the garage, holding an old box of Hannah's toys he'd kept hidden for years. He couldn't explain why he still had it. He just said, "It doesn't feel right to throw her away twice." As time passed, the case files aged with the town. Detectives who had once vowed to solve it retired or moved on. The lead investigator, Harold Benton, left the department in 1998 and died 2 years later of a heart attack. The evidence boxes, half a dozen of them, were moved to a basement storage room at the county sheriff's office, stacked among dozens of other unsolved cases. Dust gathered, labels faded. Somewhere inside one of those boxes sat a sealed bag containing a small swab from the windowsill, a piece of evidence that had once been considered useless. Every so often, the quiet would break. In 1995, a man claiming to have seen Hannah at a truck stop outside Bowling Green called the police hotline. The description matched a young girl with blonde hair traveling with a thin man in his 30s, but when officers reviewed surveillance footage, there was no sign of either. In 1998, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office, postmarked from Chattanooga, claiming to know where the little girl in Lewisburg was buried. It contained a hand-drawn map leading to an area of dense forest near the county line. Deputies spent 2 full days digging there. They found animal bones, nothing else. Each time, hope flared briefly, and each time it died the same slow death. The case became a kind of ritual in the community, something that would resurface every few years when another tip came in, only to fade back into silence when it led nowhere. By the time the new millennium began, Hannah's name had become a symbol for loss, something people referenced when they wanted to remind each other that bad things could happen even in small, quiet towns. In 2002, a new wave of forensic technology was sweeping through law enforcement. DNA profiling had become more advanced, capable of extracting identifiers from smaller and more degraded samples than ever before. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation launched a statewide initiative to re-examine cold cases involving children. Hannah's file was one of dozens flagged for review. When the evidence was sent to the lab, analysts examined it carefully. There were the old fibers, the partial prints, and that single smudge of blood found on the windowsill back in 1991. For a moment, there was renewed hope that science might finally fill the gaps left by human failure. But when the results came back, the lab report was crushingly familiar. The DNA was too degraded to build a full profile. The trace was too faint, too old, too contaminated by time. Once again, Hannah's name was added to the long list of unsolved cases. For the next decade, the file stayed quiet. The media stopped calling. Reporters moved on to newer stories, and younger detectives barely recognized the name. The house on Cedar Creek finally collapsed under its own weight, the roof caving in during a summer storm. The land was sold at auction, the lot left empty except for a patch of bare earth where the porch had been. Local kids grew up, left town, and carried only fragments of the story with them, rumors about a little girl who disappeared without a sound. But even in silence, the case never completely disappeared. Every few years, Claire would write letters to the police, asking if there was any news. They always answered politely, telling her they hadn't forgotten, though most of them had never even seen the file themselves. Mark stopped writing, stopped calling, but he still drove past the old road sometimes, parking a few 100 feet away, staring at where his home used to stand. People saw him there more than once, just sitting in his truck, engine running, like he couldn't decide if he wanted to remember or forget. Then, in 2016, something unexpected happened. A newly formed cold case unit within the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation began digitizing old files, transferring physical evidence into a centralized system. One of the analysts, a meticulous forensic scientist named Melissa Crane, pulled the Reese file at random. When she opened the evidence box, she noticed the old blood sample was still sealed, untouched since the 2002 test. It was small, barely enough to work with, but technology had changed again. Genealogical databases and advanced DNA amplification could now extract profiles from samples that were once considered unusable. On a slow afternoon, out of routine more than expectation, she decided to send the sample for reanalysis. It would take months for results to come back, and she almost forgot about it entirely. But when the data finally arrived, the lab report contained something no one had seen before: a partial but viable genetic profile. At first, it matched no one in any criminal database. But the numbers were clear, the pattern distinctive, and quietly, in the background of that small discovery, the first tremor of something bigger began to move. The story that had defined Lewisburg for 25 years was about to come back to life. And this time, it wouldn't be a rumor. It would be science, and it would speak louder than anyone's memory. By the time 2016 arrived, most people in Lewisburg had stopped believing anything new would ever come from the case. The world had changed too much. Technology had leapt ahead, new crimes filled the headlines, and the story of a little girl who vanished from her bedroom in 1991 had faded into the background. Another tragedy buried in the past. But inside the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, a newly formed cold case unit was just beginning to unearth stories that time had tried to erase. The initiative was part of a statewide effort to digitize decades-old unsolved crimes. Analysts began opening long-forgotten evidence boxes, scanning yellowed case files, and cataloging anything that could still hold a clue. For most of them, it was thankless work, a flood of paperwork and dust. But for one forensic analyst named Dr. Melissa Crane, it became an obsession. She'd grown up in Tennessee, not far from Lewisburg. She remembered seeing Hannah Reese's face on missing posters when she was a child. It was one of the first times she'd ever felt fear. So when she came across the file marked Reese, Hannah, Missing Child, 1991, she didn't move on like most would have. She pulled it closer. The box contained fragments of a story she already knew by heart, crime scene photos, reports, and one small sealed envelope labeled "Blood Trace, Bedroom Windowsill." The notes attached were brief, inconclusive. Sample too limited for profile. The lab back then hadn't been able to work with such small material. But Melissa stared at it for a long time, knowing that modern amplification technology could now extract profiles from even trace DNA. She filled out a request for reanalysis and sent the sample to the state's Advanced Forensic Lab in Nashville. It was routine paperwork to everyone else, but for her, It was a gamble that something might finally break loose. Weeks passed, then months. The results came back in early November. A full genetic profile had been successfully extracted. For the first time in 25 years, investigators had a clean, identifiable DNA sequence linked to whoever had been inside Hannah's room the night she disappeared. The profile was uploaded into a CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, and for days, Crane checked the system each morning before her coffee, waiting for a hit. Nothing came. The report went dormant, just another line in a long list of unmatched profiles. But the case didn't end there. In early 2017, Tennessee quietly partnered with a private lab that specialized in forensic genealogy, cross-referencing crime scene DNA with public ancestry databases to find distant relatives. It was a controversial practice at the time, but it had solved a handful of cold cases across the country. Crane submitted Hannah's sample for comparison, expecting little. 3 months later, she got the notification. It wasn't a direct match, it was what analysts called a familial lead. The system had found a partial genetic overlap with a 8-year-old man in Alabama, a man who'd sent his DNA to a commercial ancestry site while researching his family tree. His name was Robert Hale. He had no criminal record, no known ties to Tennessee. But the data suggested that the person responsible for the DNA at the Reese home was a close biological relative, possibly a sibling. Detectives began to dig. Robert Hale had one younger brother, Richard Hale, 61 years old, living quietly in a rural suburb outside Birmingham. His history was unremarkable on paper: retired handyman, married once, no children, minor traffic violations. But old records showed he'd lived in Lewisburg for several years during the late 1980s and early 90s. In fact, he had worked part-time for a construction company that handled small home repairs in the Cedar Creek neighborhood. When investigators cross-referenced the Reese's old address, they found his name in a contractor log. In June of 1991, 2 weeks before Hannah disappeared, Richard Hale had been hired to replace a set of porch steps at the Reese home. The discovery sent a chill through the entire cold case unit. After decades of silence, a living connection had finally emerged. In April of 2017, 2 detectives drove down to Alabama to conduct what they described as a knock and talk. They found Hale, living alone in a single-story house at the edge of town. Neighbors described him as polite but private, a man who kept to himself, mowed his lawn every Thursday, and spent weekends fishing at a nearby lake. When investigators arrived, he seemed cooperative at first, inviting them inside. But when they began asking about Lewisburg, about 1991, about a little girl named Hannah, his demeanor shifted. His hands trembled slightly. His breathing changed. He claimed not to remember the Reeses, said he'd worked for hundreds of families back then. But when one detective mentioned the porch repair, he froze for a split second, long enough for them to notice. The visit was brief. They thanked him for his time, but as soon as they left, they filed for a search warrant. Within days, the TBI coordinated with Alabama authorities to obtain a fresh DNA sample from Hale. A few strands of hair and a saliva swab were all it took. When the results came back from the lab, the match was conclusive, an exact genetic alignment with the DNA recovered from the Reese windowsill 25 years earlier. The man who had slipped silently into a child's room in the dead of night, who had eluded every search, every headline, every desperate prayer, had finally been found. When officers returned to his home with an arrest warrant, Hale's reaction was immediate and telling. He didn't protest. He didn't ask what the charge was. He just sat down in his kitchen chair, stared at the floor, and said, "It's been a long time." Neighbors watched as he was led away in handcuffs, confused and stunned. For them, Richard Hale was just an old man who kept to himself. But for investigators, he was the missing piece of a story that had haunted an entire community for decades. As the news broke, The people of Lewisburg found themselves pulled back into a past they thought they'd left behind. Reporters returned, headlines resurfaced, and for the first time since 1991, the name Hannah Reese appeared again on the evening news. The evidence was irrefutable. The blood on the windowsill had belonged to him. But even with the match confirmed, one question still lingered, heavier than any other: what had happened to her after that night. And that answer would come from Richard Hale himself, in a confession that would finally reveal what really happened to 6-year-old Hannah Reese and where she had been all this time. The interrogation began quietly, almost politely. 2 detectives, a recording device, and a man who had been hiding from his own past for more than 2 decades. Richard Hale sat across the table, his hands folded, his face blank. He was 61, with thinning gray hair and skin that looked older than his years. For the first hour, he denied. Everything said. He didn't know the Reeses, didn't remember any little girl named Hannah. But investigators had been doing this a long time, and they knew what silence looked like when it started to crack. They showed him photographs, one of the Reese home as it appeared in 1991, one of the window with the cut screen, and one of Hannah, smiling in a yellow dress. Hale didn't look at them for long. He stared instead at the table, his breathing shallow. The detectives told him about the DNA, about the blood on the sill, about how there was no mistake anymore. Every word tightened the air in the room. By the second day, he had stopped eating. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat there, waiting. After 48 hours, something broke. The official transcript notes it as a spontaneous statement. Hale lifted his head, stared at the detectives, and said quietly, "I didn't mean to kill her." From that moment on, the story that had haunted Lewisburg for 25 years began to unravel, piece by piece. Back in the summer of 1991, Hale had been hired by the Reeses to fix a broken set of porch steps. He worked there for only 2 afternoons, long enough to notice the little girl who liked to play in the yard with her stuffed bunny. He told investigators that she reminded him of his niece, sweet, trusting, curious. But as his story continued, it became clear that what he'd felt wasn't affection. It was obsession. On the night of June 14th, after drinking alone in his rented trailer, Hale drove his old truck down Cedar Creek Road. He parked just beyond the curve, engine off, lights out. He told detectives he had no plan, he just wanted to see her again. He walked through the tall grass behind the Reese property, carrying a small pocket knife, and waited. When the house went dark, he cut the window screen and climbed inside. Hannah was asleep. He said she didn't wake until he touched her shoulder. She startled, whispered for her mom. He panicked. He covered her mouth with his hand and carried her out through the window. What happened next came out in fragments, interrupted by long silences. He drove aimlessly for a while, taking back roads toward Maury County. Hannah cried in the passenger seat, asking to go home. When he pulled over near an old logging road, she tried to run. He chased after her in the dark, shouting for her to stop. He said he grabbed her by the arm, spun her around, and struck her once hard enough that she fell and didn't move again. There was no excuse offered, no moment of remorse in his voice when he said it, just a quiet statement of fact. He told investigators he froze for hours, sitting on the ground beside her. When dawn approached, he wrapped her small body in a blanket from his truck and buried her under a thick bed of pine needles near an abandoned logging trail. He marked the spot in his memory but never returned. He quit his job in town a week later and moved to Alabama. For years, he convinced himself that what happened wasn't real, that no one would ever find out. After the confession, search teams from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation descended on the area. He described an overgrown section of forest off Highway 50, forgotten and untouched since the early 90s. The location matched his details exactly. Investigators marked a section of ground beneath a cluster of pine trees where the soil looked disturbed. They worked in silence, removing layer after layer of roots and needles until a faint outline appeared beneath the earth. Beneath the dirt was the decayed fabric of a child's blanket, and within it, fragile remains that had been protected only by time and chance. The discovery stopped everyone on site. Hardened detectives, some of whom had been young officers during the original search, stood back as forensic teams documented the scene. It took 2 full days to recover every fragment, every piece of evidence that could still speak. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. After 25 years, Hannah Reese had been found. When the news broke, it spread faster than it had in 1991. National networks picked up the story. Reporters flooded back into Lewisburg, the same way they had a generation earlier, but this time they came not for rumors or theories. They came for closure. Interviews aired with former detectives who could barely hold their composure. Some spoke through tears, admitting they'd never stopped thinking about her case. The sheriff who'd once promised to find her stood before cameras again, this time with gray hair and a quivering voice, saying simply, "We kept that promise. It just took too long." For the Reese family, the news arrived like an old wound reopening. Claire, now in her 60s, received the call from a TBI agent who had worked the case since the early 2000s. She didn't speak at first, just listened, eyes wet, hands shaking. Mark heard the news from his son, born years after Hannah's disappearance. He said nothing for a long time, then whispered that maybe now she could rest. The small town of Lewisburg gathered once again, just like it had all those years ago, but this time it wasn't for a search. It was to light candles outside the courthouse, to say goodbye properly. Hannah's remains were released to her family, and the old church on Main Street overflowed with people who remembered her face from the posters that once covered every telephone pole. For the investigators who had worked on the case, the moment was both victory and grief. The truth had been found, but it carried no comfort, just the heavy knowledge of how easily it could have been prevented. Richard Hale was charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. During his arraignment, he said nothing. His public defender entered a plea of guilty months later. The courtroom was silent when the judge read the sentence: life in prison. As he was led away, reporters shouted questions. Why? How? Did he ever think about what he'd done? He didn't answer any of them. But one officer who escorted him later said that when they passed a pine grove on the way to the correctional facility, Hale looked out the window and muttered something no one could quite hear. In the days that followed, the Reese home, long since torn down, became the focus of news footage again. A drone shot of the empty lot aired nationwide, the caption reading simply, "Found after 25 years." For the people of Lewisburg, the discovery brought a strange kind of peace. The mystery that had haunted them was finally over. But for those who had lived through it, for those who had searched the woods, held vigils, or prayed for a miracle, peace felt complicated. Because even with the truth finally uncovered, the question that lingered wasn't who anymore, it was why. And that question, no confession, could ever really answer. The morning of the memorial was quiet, too quiet for what it represented. 25 years had passed since the night Hannah Reese vanished from her bedroom. Yet for those who stood on the small hill overlooking the Lewisburg cemetery, time hadn't really moved at all. The faces were older now, lined and pale, but the grief carried the same shape it always had. Claire and Mark Reese stood together in front of a simple white headstone engraved with their daughter's name, the same name that once filled newspaper headlines and missing posters that had long since faded from the town's memory. The service was small, meant to be private, but word spread quickly. Within an hour, dozens of people gathered quietly behind the family neighbors, retired detectives, and those who had searched the woods all those years ago. Reporters stood back at a respectful distance, cameras lowered, as the wind moved through the tall grass. The pastor spoke softly about closure, about peace, about the mercy of answers. But everyone knew that answers rarely brought comfort. When the service ended, a young reporter from Nashville approached Claire. She was nervous, her microphone shaking slightly as she asked if justice finally felt real. Claire paused, looking at the grave, at the small photo of Hannah in the corner, 6 years old, gap-toothed, forever frozen in the last summer she was alive. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "It doesn't bring her back," she said quietly. "But now she's not lost." Those words would appear in headlines across the country the next day, but for Claire, they weren't meant for the world. They were meant for herself, for the version of her that had lived 25 years between two worlds, the one where Hannah was missing and the one where she was gone. Richard Hale never went to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confession, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The hearing lasted less than an hour. He stood silently as the judge read the sentence, staring down at his hands. There was no apology, no visible emotion, just the same hollow stillness that had defined him since his arrest. 2 years later, in 2019, he died of heart failure in his prison cell. Officials said he passed in his sleep. When the news reached Lewisburg, no one celebrated. It just felt like another door closing on something no one wanted to revisit. Hale's family, 2 brothers and a niece, released a statement to the press soon after his death. They expressed remorse and apologized to the Reese family and the town. They said they had never known what he'd done, that they had lived their lives unaware that their relative had taken a child's life and buried her beneath the pines. Some people in Lewisburg didn't believe them. Others simply chose not to care. For them, the only thing that mattered was that the shadow that had hung over their community for a generation was finally gone. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation later called the case a landmark example of how forensic genealogy could solve what once seemed unsolvable. The process that had led to Hale's arrest, using public ancestry databases to trace a suspect through family DNA, was still new at the time. The agency would go on to solve nearly a dozen cold cases in the years that followed using the same method. In training seminars across the country, Hannah's story became a case study. How one trace of blood, preserved on a window frame and forgotten in an evidence box, had become the thread that pulled truth out of silence. For the investigators who had worked the original search, the breakthrough felt like both triumph and guilt. Some admitted privately that they'd long assumed the case would never be solved. Others said they still dreamed about the night she went missing, the flashlights sweeping through the woods, the sound of her mother's voice calling out her name. The TBI placed a memorial plaque in the agency's headquarters, dedicated to unsolved child abduction cases, engraved with Hannah's name at the top. Beneath it were the words, "Time remembers what people forget." In Lewisburg, the story slowly shifted from horror to legacy. The town began hosting an annual community safety event in her memory, focusing on child protection and forensic awareness. Her former elementary school, long since renovated, dedicated a small playground in her honor. For Claire, who visited once each spring, it was a strange comfort to see other children playing beneath the plaque that bore her daughter's name. It was proof that Hannah had not been erased, even if her life had been stolen. Mark rarely spoke about the case publicly again. Friends said he found his own quiet way of coping, working in his garden, helping neighbors fix fences, living small and simple. In one interview years later, he said, "The worst thing about losing someone that way isn't the loss itself. It's the not knowing. Once you know, even if it hurts, the silence finally breaks." When Hale's death was reported, Claire didn't attend any interviews or issue a statement. She kept to herself, as she always had, but one neighbor recalled that she left a single fresh flower on Hannah's grave. That morning, a white lily, placed neatly against the stone. The same neighbor swore she heard her whisper something before walking away, but whatever it was, she never told anyone. By the time the 20th anniversary of Hannah's disappearance came and went, Lewisburg had changed. New families moved in. The lot where the Reese home once stood was sold, cleared, and rebuilt into a small modern house. The people living there now probably never knew the story. But some nights, when the air was still and the woods along Cedar Creek grew dark, old residents said they could still feel the memory of that summer, the sound of search dogs, the echo of sirens, the way the entire town seemed to hold its breath for weeks. And in a way, they had. For 25 years, the community carried the weight of a mystery that defined a generation. When Hannah was found, it wasn't just her family that exhaled. It was everyone. The teachers who had kept her drawings, the deputies who never stopped checking the file, the people who prayed for answers long after hope had dimmed. The discovery didn't erase the pain, but it lifted the question that had haunted them. What happened to her? In the end, the story of Hannah Reese became more than a tragedy. It became a reminder of how far technology and persistence could reach. One strand of DNA had done what hundreds of searchers, detectives, and years of speculation could not. It had spoken the truth. As the case closed and the final reports were filed, one TBI agent summed it up quietly in an internal memo. Sometimes, the evidence just waits for time to catch up. And that's what this story became. A bridge between grief and discovery, between silence and justice. For the Reeses, it wasn't closure in the way people imagined. It was simply an ending. But even now, as investigators continue to open old boxes and re-examine forgotten evidence from the 1980s and 1990s, one question lingers in every cold case unit across the country. How many more answers are still waiting locked inside those boxes, sealed in plastic, buried under years of dust waiting, like Hannah's, for time and science to finally speak?